Welcome back to the BJJ Fanatics podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Ford. My guest today is a third-degree black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He also holds a black belt in Judo. He's one of the longest-running students of Professor John Danaher. He's a highly respected instructor and has been teaching in Brooklyn, New York for 18 years. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to be joined today by Professor Brian Glick. How are you today, Brian?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. No, the pleasure is all mine, sir. I appreciate you taking the time to be here. The question I always like to start with everyone, tell us about where you're from originally and what your life was like before you found jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, so I grew up in Washington, D.C. I moved to New York in 1994. And, I didn't really play any sports. I wasn't particularly athletic. If you had looked at me when I was in my early 20s, before I started jiu-jitsu, I certainly wasn't the person that you would pick, probably either to start jiu-jitsu or to stick with it as long as I have. But I was a pretty studious person. I went to college, and I was kind of I like to read. So I didn't dislike physical activity. I mean, I was doing stuff, but I certainly wasn't I was never big into going to the gym. I was never on sports teams. I wasn't really like a joiner in that way. So, I had graduated college, and I was working some jobs in New York, and, like a lot of post college graduates in New York, if you're not going into like a definite career, at least this was at the time when I was a student and I had just graduated. New York was like a little bit different. You could kind of get away with this a little bit more. But, I was working small jobs. I was working in restaurants. I did some work in the fashion industry, and it was just kind of like picking up little jobs here and there. And things didn't really kind of click for me until I was really doing jiu-jitsu and that was, the time in my life where things kind of came into much more focus. So everything before that is a little bit of a blur.
That's awesome. That's great. Well, yeah. I love seeing all the diverse different backgrounds of people that come into martial arts, because a lot of people transition over from sports and other combat arts and athletics. But there's a lot of people who are just really like intellectual types and who weren't on sports teams and things like that, who find martial arts and become obsessed, and then find jiu-jitsu and become obsessed. So how did you first find jiu-jitsu? How did that connection?
Yeah. So in 1990, let's see, this is probably actually more like 1999, I think, or 1999, 2000. A friend of mine came to, a woman that I knew, her brother came to visit in New York. And we were all hanging out, and we got to talking about what we did and, the things that we were into. And he had said, I think he was an X-ray technician at the time. That was his day job, but he was really into martial arts. And, I wasn't practicing martial arts, but I always kind of thought that martial arts were cool. I had heard of the UFC. It had happened, first UFC, maybe first 2 or 3 UFCs had happened already. When I was a kid, I grew up during a time when there was the Karate Kid was like the top movie. So there was like a big groundswell around martial arts during that time. And I was never a karate student, but I think if you talk to people who grew up during that time, you'll find that like a lot of us have these memories, like just kind of like a vague background of like martial arts being this kind of cool thing. And it was very, I don't want to get too off track, but it was a very different thing than I think the people who were like of previous generations, where like the martial arts movies of that time were like either, dubbed kung fu movies, or they were like Bruce Lee, Chuck Norris movies, So for me, when I was a kid, it was like Karate Kid, and that was just like it wasn't just me, but like it blew everybody's mind. It was like, oh, it's introducing this crazy thing. And it was like, this nerdy kid, and like, he was kind of always getting beaten up, and, he found a sensei. So, we look at it now, and it's like kind of, I think it still holds a little bit of mystique for people, but it's hard to overstate how big a deal it was when it first came out. I mean, you may remember, but it was definitely a big thing. And then after that, I was into it's funny how like movies provide us with such a kind of, culturally things flow in from movies, but, Steven Seagal, like that was the next thing, when Steven Seagal came out, it was just like, what is this? This guy was like a magician. It was totally crazy. It was like action, but he was like breaking people with his hands. It was just, nobody could like, it was amazing. Yeah. So I kind of had that in my consciousness already. So when this guy was like, I do martial arts, I was like, I didn't dismiss it. And I certainly wasn't like, those guys aren't so tough, but I was a little bit like, oh, I didn't realize that that's a thing that like adult people did, for hobbies, for fun. So I had said to him, that sounds interesting. What do you do? What kind of martial arts do you do? And he had actually grown up doing karate with, he was in California. And so there were a lot of well-known karate practitioners had come from Japan to teach and train in California. And he was a student of a pretty well-known karate guy named Fumio Demura. And so he had been a long-time student of Demura's, but he was also practicing kickboxing. He was doing Thai boxing. And again, like in the 90s, like late 90s, Thai boxing was still this weird thing. It didn't have the kind of cachet that it has now. There wasn't like such a thing as like fitness kickboxing. There had been like Taibo, as like a trend, like that was a thing. But if you were doing Muay Thai, that was like really, hardcore. It was like, shin on shin, knocking people out. It was intense. So he was doing that. And then he was also doing, there's this wild group in California that kind of combined grappling with stick fighting called the Dog Brothers.
Yeah, the Dog Brothers.
And Dog Brothers were like totally nuts. Like it was like, just UFC, like people who thought the UFC was like this crazy. It was like, these guys were like, it was like ultimate fighting on like acid and steroids. It was totally crazy. Just like whacking each other with sticks in the public park. So he wasn't doing that, but I think he was doing some like Kali. So anyways, we got into a conversation. It was a pretty short conversation, but he said, I do all of these things. I do Kali, which is stick fighting. Have you heard of the Dog Brothers? I was like, who are they? And then he was saying, he did Muay Thai and Thai kickboxing. But then he said, the real thing I really do is I'm really into ground fighting. And I was like, that's basically the dumbest thing I've ever heard, because everybody knows that nobody fights on the ground. Everybody fights standing up, except for Steven Seagal in that scene in, Above the Law, where he gets down on his knees. And like I said, I was like, everybody fights on their feet. Yeah, everybody fights on their feet. Like Chuck Norris, Bruce Lee, Van Damme, everybody fights on their feet. He's like, no. He's like, have you ever heard of, the Gracie family? And I hadn't heard of anything. So I was like, I've never heard of anything. He's like, okay, well, he's like, I'm going to show you kind of what it is. It's like holds and locks and things. And I was like, yeah, I didn't, we were just sitting around. We didn't have anything else to do. So he's like, okay, come here. So he kind of laid down on the ground. And I kind of rolled my eyes, and I don't know whether it was, he like put me in a guillotine or he put me in a triangle. I think it might have been a triangle. And he was like, this is an example of like what the, what a lock is or what a hold is. And he didn't he gave me no preliminaries. He was like, just kind of do this. So he put the triangle on. And like, I didn't know I was supposed to tap or say anything. Oh, no. So I was like, I was in the thing, like gurgling and like I couldn't breathe and I thought I was going to die. And so eventually, he let go, and he wasn't being a jerk about it. He was just like, so I remember like getting up and being like, what the hell is this? And he was like, yeah, it's pretty cool. And I was like, yeah. I was like, it seems kind of weird, but like maybe it's cool. And he said, well, if you're interested, there's one of the Gracies actually lives in New York. And we were, at the time I was living on 30th Street in Manhattan. And he was like, I think, you can probably look up where, you can probably look up and see if you can find, one of the Gracies. You can go learn this stuff. He said, you might want to try it out. It's good for self-defense. And you see if you like it. And so I said, okay, I told him I would do that. When he left me with, in those days, all you had were VHS tapes. So he had left me with maybe like Horion's first instructional. He left me with Gracie in Action 1 and maybe UFC 1 and 2 on these VHS tapes. And he's like, if you're, he was like, if you're into this stuff, you might like this. And so I said, thanks. And I did what we did back in those days, which was I went to the Yellow Pages because we didn't have the internet. And so I tried to find, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. And sure enough, it was in the Yellow Pages. And I went to, I called and there was no answer. And I was like, well, I'm going to go there. So I went to the address that was listed. It was like the second floor of a weird building, like in kind of Midtown. It wasn't that far from my house. And I got there and someone was there and they were like, no, it's not here anymore. It just moved. So, and this was when, back in the old days, the Renzo Gracie Academy, it was originally in a shared space. And then right at that time, like just before I kind of came knocking on the door, they had moved to their own space. So then I had to figure out, like, they kind of like, it was like, this is all really like, someone gave me like a piece of paper that they thought maybe was the address. And it was like, I went there and like on the corner was like a hot dog stand. And I was like, this is definitely not the place. And it was kind of like the equivalent of like a dark alley. And I was walking down it. And so I went in and this was at the time, and maybe you've heard these stories, but the academy was on like maybe the third floor or fourth floor, and the floor below that was a methadone clinic for, like recovering, people who have been on drugs, recovering from that stuff. So like, it was nuts, it was like, I got in, like someone was in the elevator, like kind of like stumbled out and like bumped into me. And I was like, this is bizarre. I got in the elevator. I get it. So in the old academy, you would get up there and the doors would open and you would just kind of like there was no like real vestibule. It was just kind of like you were like right in the academy, and it was just like mats. And I remember, getting out of the elevator, and I was by myself and the place was empty except for one kind of jacked guy who was sitting behind the desk. And he was wearing like an old football jersey. And I was like, is this the jiu-jitsu school? Like, are you Renzo Gracie? I had no idea. And the guy had kind of a weird accent. And I was like, but he was like, there are no classes right now. He gave me a schedule. And he was like, why don't you come back at this time? And, you have you pay for your class and you can have a uniform. And I was like, I guess so. So that was the first time I met John Danaher. He was the guy behind the desk.
Oh, wow.
I left. And then I was like, this is a really weird thing. But thankfully, like the girl I was dating at the time was like, yeah, like, I think, you might, maybe you should do it. Maybe you should try it. I was like, oh, I guess so. So I went back and that was it. I went to the first class. It was totally insane. But I was like, I think I did have a feeling that, if I could, it was like a good challenge for me in the sense, like, the physical challenge was just like unquestionable. I mean, I was 100% the weakest person in the room. And like, I know, like everybody was bigger, everybody was stronger. Certainly everybody was tougher. And, but I was like, I think that if I can do this and like maybe make it a week or maybe make it 2 weeks in this environment, that'll mean something. Like I didn't know what I was going to learn for sure. And, even in that first week, there was a lot of good technical information, even back then. So things were making sense, but I was like, I think like if I can actually do this, there was like a sense in which after I was, even again, if I'd only made it for like a week or a month, I would be better at all of this. Like I would be better at self-defense. I would have a sense of how to fight and like kind of carry myself and take care of myself. And like all this stuff that we think about the martial arts kind of meaning. I knew that like that would be actually like something that I could have afterwards. And I think that was the thing that kept me coming back. And it was, it was good. I was able to actually learn some things. And I felt like I saw some progress. And, after a couple months, I was like, well, maybe I'll stick around for another couple months. And then after another couple months of that, I was like, well, it's I don't have anything else going on.
Might as well.
I never left. So
that's incredible. What a cool story. I love hearing all the old stories of the old Blue Basement, man. Did you happen to know Paul Creighton from those days?
Oh yeah. I remember Paul. Yeah.
Paul's my instructor. He promoted me to brown belt. So he
oh, nice.
He has all these great stories of the old Blue Basement, man. Particularly in the methadone location. In
the methadone clinic. Yeah. I mean, Paul, there was a time when you showed up in those days, and I don't mean to be like in the old days, because I still feel like part of me feels like I'm still kind of just getting started in this stuff. But I remember back in those days, like, there were a few people who were like, if you were a purple belt, you were a god on earth. There was just like no one kind of knew how you got to be a purple belt. No one knew like where these guys had come from, especially like if you walked in and someone was a purple belt, it was like, what did they have to do to get there? The whole place seems so crazy. It's like, how do you distinguish yourself? But Paul, there were a few other guys at that time. Of course, Mr. Danaher, Sean Williams, Gene Dunn, Joe Darcy, the McTighe brothers. There was like this crew of guys who just seemed like cut from granite and like just next level. And Paul was definitely in that group for me. I remember definitely idolizing all of those guys.
That's so cool. What a cool time, man. Brian, rewinding back to those years, there's a story about you that I would love to have you provide us with the details of, because it'll lead us right into the topic today that I really want to cover with you. Tell us about Professor Danaher's thoughts he shared with you in your early days in jiu-jitsu about your overall progress.
Yeah. So, like I was saying, when I first started, I was, every once in a while I come across like an old picture of myself, around like when I started, white belt or blue belt. And I just was a very unlikely, I think, jiu-jitsu person at that time. Now I think jiu-jitsu is, much more, because there are so many more people doing it, and people are entering from all different places and stages and ages and things like that. But at the time, it was still very much like an extreme activity. It was on the margins a little bit. And one of the ways that I think about it is, it's kind of like how skateboarding or, like kind of BMX bike riding or snowboarding kind of made their way into the mainstream. They began as these like real niche activities, and especially skateboarding, which was kind of like, it was like it was like kind of like the bastard child of surfing, and like it didn't really have a place. And I feel like there was a period where jiu-jitsu was kind of like the bastard child of martial arts, where everyone was like, yeah, it's effective, but it just doesn't have the same kind of feel. And, it's Brazilian. It's not really from, it's not from the Far East. So it's not kind of as exotic. It was like, had all of these things that made it super weird. And so I think that, when I showed up, I was kind of, again, like, although I did feel like I was a little bit kind of outside of things. Like I told you, like I've never been like really a joiner. I was never like hardcore sports guy or like, but at the same time, I do think that I was, the classes were populated by really three types. they were, especially the ones that I was going to, because I was going there during the day. A lot of times I was working at night. Like I said, I was a waiter and doing a couple of other things in the evenings. There were people who were professional, like bouncers and security people, like people who basically fought for a living. And they were there to train in order to be able to understand the mechanics of grappling and how to, like, literally how to subdue people. There were cops, there were a lot of cops, law enforcement people who were there, some firefighters, people who were, again, like, whose careers were around being strong and, kind of rough and tough, and their jobs involved putting themselves in the line of fire, like literally or figuratively. They were really, a lot of tough people. So you had people who kind of fought for a living. You had people who were cops, and then you had basically people who were criminals, and the other, like everybody else, so it was like, if you're not getting paid to fight for a living, you're not expected to break up fights, like, why do you need to learn how to grapple and kind of do this stuff? It's like a little weird. So there was that whole kind of crew, and I was definitely not any of that. And I think that, even though I was making some progress in the training, I think I did have a kind of fragile quality, at the time. I think I still probably, I think sometimes I feel like I still have fragile quality, but, I definitely think kind of for Mr. Danaher, even for Sean Williams, for like a lot of these guys looking at me, I think I really did look like, I might not make it. And not just like I was going to burn out and not make it, but like, I wasn't going to make it, like maybe I was going to die, or like I was going to get my arm broken, or like, put in a bad situation or something like that. And I was though, a really sincere student, at least, I mean, from my perspective, in the sense that, I wanted to learn. I was there because I wanted to do jiu-jitsu. Like, I wasn't there because I wanted to be an MMA fighter. I didn't at the beginning, I didn't care about being a black belt. Like, I didn't know where it was going to go. All I wanted to do was learn, and I wanted to learn from the people who knew more than I did. And like I said, at the time, that was basically everybody. People who were purple belts were like at this god tier, but people who were blue belts were like, I mean, those were like upperclassmen. It was kind of like the senior and you're the freshman. So I think that was how I was approaching it. But at the same time, I didn't have any of these physical traits or qualities that would, that I think that people needed more at that time than now, but really you needed that at the time. So I think that in a way, Mr. Danaher kind of looked at me and was like, if I don't try to dissuade this guy, I'll be doing him a disservice, And so that was kind of how it came about, where he was like, you seem like a nice guy. You seem like you're, smart, and you're a good student, but he knew very well who was around. He knew very well kind of what the group dynamic was. And he was like, I just don't think this is the right thing for you. Maybe there's something else that you'd be better suited for. And, I think I wasn't so shocked at the time, because I didn't even think, I kind of agreed with him, in a way, not like in a way where I didn't have like the confidence to do it, but in a way I was like, oh, like, he wasn't telling me something I didn't know, like I know I don't fit in here. Like, I'm not like the rest of these guys. And so I kind of thought about that. Now, he didn't say never come back, but he did say, you should think probably pretty carefully about whether this is something you really want to be doing. And I think I did think about it. And it was a rhetorical question. I didn't need to like come back to him with an answer. At least I didn't feel like that. So what I did was I just showed up again for the next class. And I said, like, I think in my mind, I thought to myself, well, maybe the next one will be my last one. I certainly didn't want to like upset, make him mad. And I think if I come back the second time after he had said that, and he was like, I told you to get the hell out of here. I don't know, I mean, there are all sorts of, apocryphal martial arts stories about like the students sitting on the steps of the dojo waiting to be let in. I don't know if I would have had that in me, to kind of sit in the pouring rain and like, but as it was, I was like, hey man, like maybe I'll quit the next one, maybe I'll quit next week. And as time went by, I think that I don't want to say that, I proved him wrong. I think that I was kind of like, I'm kind of still here, and it hasn't gotten so bad that I feel like I need to quit. And I did have injuries, but I didn't have any catastrophic injuries. And so I ended up kind of sticking around. And I think because of that, it was, a hurdle I had stepped over, which whether it was intentional or not, was a demonstration of my commitment to training in jiu-jitsu. And the fact that I didn't have to construct it and be like, oh, I'm signing a document that says I'm committed, like I'm making a commitment. It was just like, no, I actually am going to do this. And then maybe you're right. And maybe in 2 weeks I will want to quit, and maybe I will get my arm broken, and then I'll just go on with the rest of my life. And that day kind of never came. And as a result, we ended up having, I think partly because of that, we ended up having this really like lifelong bond. I mean, the relationship that I have with him is, the longest lasting relationship really that I have in my life. I mean, I've known him longer than I've known my wife, and it's been a very significant and important relationship for me on the mat, but then off the mat, just in terms of how my life has unfolded. Because, when you meet someone in your 20s and that person stays in your life into your 40s, that's a really long time. And so that person kind of sees you changing and sees how you evolve and the mistakes that you make. And that's a really powerful thing. And then, I like to think that, and I was there too, I stayed with him, and I'm, we're no longer in the same city because, now they're down in Austin, but, and I'm here in New York. It's that relationship hasn't changed, it's, if anything, it's gotten stronger over the years, which I'm very grateful for.
That's incredible. What a cool story. I mean, there's so many things that can be taken from that story. Obviously perseverance, like, just the benefits of staying committed to something, even if you're not good at it at first, and just putting your nose to the grindstone and really practicing and learning and taking the time to show up and learn. It really is a great testament to your perseverance. The other thing is I appreciate you sharing that story, because it leads us right into what I wanted to discuss with you in depth today. The topic I wanted to discuss with you is survival in jiu-jitsu. Survival is something that we all have to learn how to do when we start, and it isn't exclusive to being a white belt either. I mean, blue belts have to learn how to survive against advanced ranks. Advanced ranks have to learn how to survive in the advanced classes and in competition training, and even like new black belts have to learn how to survive in competition against more seasoned black belts. So survival truly is part of the essence of jiu-jitsu, right? Brian, what do you credit to helping you survive those tough early days in the blue basement that even Professor Danaher thought you might not survive?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is none of us really, anybody who survives in jiu-jitsu or in judo or in any of these like combat sports, where the emphasis is not just on purely on technique, but there is like a randori component, there is like a sparring component, and you need support. And so one of the things that I had over the years was I had a lot of really good support in terms of like it came in a lot of different forms. Like I was saying, it came first and foremost, from my teacher. And I think that for people who might be listening, cultivating a relationship with your instructor, I think, is one of the very best things that you can do as a student. And it's easier now, I think, because there are other influences that kind of come into your practice. But in my experience, having a real deep relationship with like your teacher, there's no substitute for that. And I think that if I didn't feel like if I was supported, and I'll kind of give you define that for you in a sec, but if I didn't feel like I had support, I think it would have been really, really difficult to do, because you do encounter, there's so many, and again, this as a practitioner, and anybody who's listening, this, but the training can be, sometimes it's fun and, you've got people that you like, but a lot of times you're in that crucible. And even if you're not a competitor, and now I was never a competitor, I wasn't like, that just wasn't the thing that juiced me. And there were a lot of reasons for it, but even if you're not in like the crucible of competition, if you're in a tough room and you're a smaller person or a weaker person or an older person or a newer person or whatever, there's a lot of pressure, and there's a lot of you have to deal with a lot of pressure externally and then internally. So if you don't have support in some way, it's going to be tough. So that's the first thing. And I think when I say support, I don't mean coddling, because none of us, after a certain point, most people, I say probably 90% of people who are doing jiu-jitsu, we don't need coddling. If you want coddling, you go somewhere else. But support can be this tough love support. Support can be, straight talk. Support can be holding your feet to the fire. It does, it can look a lot of different ways. And I think that there are extremes where, you don't want someone holding your nose to the grindstone until you don't have a nose left. That's not helpful either. Sure. But having support so that you may not see your ceiling, you may not see your capacity, or you may not see your potential. And it's very important to have someone who has been there and done that, who does see that and will give you this kind of support that you need to be able to climb the ladder on your own. So I think that support is one. The other thing is you need support from your peers, in the traditional martial arts environment. And I know a lot of people are like, traditional martial arts don't work. It's no sparring. It's all that stuff. But there were some things that they got right. In the traditional martial arts environment, you had the sensei who is the teacher. And then they had these, you had the role of the senpai. And the senpai was always the senior student, the guy or the girl who had been around for the longest. And they knew the intricate workings of how the dojo worked. They knew the pecking order, and they knew, kind of how everything was supposed to be. So the junior student, then you had a junior student who was the kohai. You had the kohai was the new person. Then you had the senpai who was the senior student. And then you had the sensei who was the main teacher. And so having this kind of senpai relationship, so support from people who are your seniors and your peers, that's also really important. I'm not a team guy. That's not to say I don't support people that are around me, but the idea of a team was never a thing for me. And I think for a lot of people who do jiu-jitsu, it is an individual activity in that sense, when you're grappling, whether you're on the mat in the classroom or it's randori or you're in a tournament, you're kind of by yourself. It's not a soccer team, football team. But in the kind of culture, the kind of cultural experience of being inside a school, there's an ecology to it. There's kind of a way that things interact. So I had a lot of really good senpai. I had a lot of really good senior people who were providing me with, technical guidance or encouragement or support or critical guidance, where they're, bad idea, not good. And a lot of, some of those people became very close friends of mine off the mat also. Others of them, I didn't know them except on the mat. And they provided a lot for me, because if you don't have that, it's going to be a hard road. And then, you also need the support of like your kind of your local group, like the people who started with you, or the people who you are just kind of naturally friends with. Jiu-Jitsu is, even though it is an individual activity, it's also a social activity. So, you do form relationships, you do form bonds with people. So I think just in the kind of the sense of relationships and connections, you need that if you want to be able to survive. So, so that's one thing. I think that a lot of times, people like to talk about, how jiu-jitsu is kind of good for your ego, and like, you have to submit your ego. And there's like a lot of lip service paid to that. People say like, no, it's not, I don't have any ego. Like we can roll together, but that's not often the case. It's like, it's more true in theory than it is in practice in a lot of places.
Sure.
And that's true from the top down too. It's like your peers, but also it's like your instructors sometimes. So I think that if for survival purposes, one of the very best ways that you can learn how to survive is to actually check your ego at the door. And I think it's a much bigger task than people realize, we all have this kind of feeling. I think for many of us, the reason that we show up to do jiu-jitsu in the first place is it's because it's an ego kind of booster, and in martial arts, we say, oh, like it's confidence, but there's a really fine line between developing confidence and then just kind of like hardening your ego as the person who is at the center of the story all the time. Yeah. So, how do you like actually do that? Well, again, the people who have not just survived, but I've seen have really thrived, tend to be very willing in training and in practice to just kind of like own their mistakes, make mistakes, and allow other people to kind of have what they want. So in training, I think there was a long time where, I wanted techniques to work. And I remember this kind of, when I was a blue belt and I was a purple belt, like, you want techniques to work, but I just never felt like I needed to be right all the time. And so I didn't want a technique. And I think this came from my instructor, like what you want is for the technique to work. But if it requires some kind of like forcing it or like, kind of crushing in order to make it work, it's kind of like putting a square peg in a round hole. And it's not actually following the principle of the technique or the idea of the technique. And so I always felt like in the training, one of my goals was to be as clean and clear an expression of the technique as possible. And then if the technique did what it was supposed to do, things would work. And that seemed to be true. Like if your mechanics on the arm lock are the way that they're supposed to be, and you've been taught the right way, and you've been listening, and you've been kind of implementing the right way, you don't need a lot of extra stuff. And so to tie that back to the point about ego, like if I felt like someone's defense to the arm lock was better than my arm lock, it meant there was a problem with my arm lock. And it was like an invitation to go back and see if I could improve it. It wasn't an invitation to, like, it wasn't a personal insult to me that someone escaped my arm lock. It wasn't like, I didn't feel like I was a worse practitioner or, I didn't deserve my blue belt. It was like, oh, something is wrong here that I didn't do. There is an answer. There is a solution. We need to figure out what it is. I have someone who I trust that I can ask. And so I would try to do that. And that's like one example, I think. And I think that when you train with people in that way, you're at much less risk of colliding negatively with people, because it's like, hey man, again, and I wouldn't always, like, emotionally, you have to be able to process this, because it's not always like, you're not always happy about it. I want to finish the arm lock. I don't want you, Ryan, to defend it. But, if you defend it and you escape, if I feel like I've got to come back and like show you who's boss, it usually moves us further away from the technique and like a rational application of it. And it moves us more into this kind of like, who's the best? And I don't know. I mean, different people are the best at different things, so that's kind of and I don't mean that like different, everybody's great. I mean, like, some people are really great at, EBI rules. Other people are really great at at submission only rules. Other people are really great at IBJJF rules. It's just, you can kind of take it as far as you like, but if the thing that you need to do is show people that you're kind of the best in the day-to-day training, you're going to have some problems. And so I think surviving involves actually like letting the other person do their best. And then if your best is as good or better than theirs, great. You don't have as many things to fix. And if it's not, then you got some things to fix. That's why you're in class. That's why you have a teacher. That's why you're training. That's why it's called practice, because you're doing it again and again. So I think that's part of it, and kind of related to that. And I think this will kind of be my last point on this is, a lot of times I think people feel like when they're training, they can't, they're encountering a lot of resistance, or they feel like, they have to be tougher, they have to be stronger. It's like, one of the best things that you can do, I think, especially if you're, if you want to learn jiu-jitsu, is to like become the sort of partner that you want to have in the training, and then like, if you kind of become the sort of partner that you want to have, you tend to attract more people who want that sort of partner. And then it kind of becomes a virtuous cycle after that. It's like, I train like technically and pretty easy. So like, if you kind of smash through me, is that really rewarding for you? I don't know, maybe, but you tend to attract more people who are like interested in what you're interested in. It's like a lot of other things in your life, So I think that's another tool that people can use to think about survival. And, it also keeps you away from catastrophic injuries where, you suddenly stand, like you find yourself in the standing position. You were down on the ground. Now you're both standing up, and you feel like you've got to do whatever it takes in order to put that person down on the ground. And you start making rash decisions in the moment that are not technical. They forget, you're not in mind of safety or who's around you or what the rules are. And it just like kind of flows from there, usually into kind of negative situations. So if you can keep that stuff in check, you tend to have safer training. You tend to have better training. You tend to have more technical training. And all of those things, when you add them up, they tend to contribute to your survival overall. If you look at the people around you who are dropping out, what's happening? They're getting injured. They're getting frustrated. They're getting disillusioned. They feel like they don't have friends, or they're not connecting with people. Well, there are ways around that. So that's been my experience in any case.
Brian, you've done such a tremendous job illustrating the reality that a lot of times what causes someone to not survive their journey in jiu-jitsu is their own undoing. It's usually an ego problem. It's having an unhealthy mindset, and that causes people to either burn out or quit or get injured, like you said. So I think a lot of people that heard me ask that initial question might have expected more technical stuff, like how do I survive getting beaten up on the mats? Your answer goes so much deeper, and I really do appreciate that, because ultimately, it's not that people die on the mats. No, when we say survival, like, people aren't dying in jiu-jitsu. Are you going to keep showing up? Are you going to be able to make it to the black belt? Right. And you highlighted so well the things that can prevent that.
Yeah. And I think, yes. And I think that, I think that for technical answers are great too. Don't get me wrong. Like, there are definitely technical answers to specific problems that people face on the mat, which will also contribute to your survival. There's no question. But I do think, if some of these other things are not in place, technique can only take you so far until you're at a level where you have to ultimately in jiu-jitsu, you have to go beyond survival. You have to go from, if you're only surviving, it's a very baseline kind of experience. And I do think for people who begin, survival is a very good goal. That should be the first thing, because if you're going in and you're getting smashed all the time, people are passing your guard, they're mounting you, you're getting arm locked, you will not hang out for too long. You do have to figure out a way to survive. But beyond that, once you meet that baseline, you need to move from surviving to thriving. And the way that you make that change from just surviving to thriving, I think that has a lot to do with, the technical choices that you're making, the style in which you're training, the sort of people you're training with, the overall approach of the culture of the school that you're a part of, so there are 100% there are technical elements to it, but you have to, it's like, I'm not a surfer, but the way I understand it, if you want to surf waves, you have to go out past the break. Like, you have to surf out past where the waves are pushing you back into the shore. And if you can never get out past the break, you're always like, your whole job is going to be about just swimming from the shore out to the point of the break. And then you get exhausted. You're just kind of keep getting pushed back, and it gets discouraging. You get frustrated. It's not until you get out past the break where you can actually start to focus on all of the technical elements of surfing and your balance and riding the wave itself and picking which wave and understanding all of those things. So I think there's a kind of analogy there between those that oftentimes white to blue belt, especially, but even white belt to purple belt sometimes, is like trying to get out past the break. And if you can do that, then you have a different job to do. It's not necessarily easier, but it's a very different job. And if you can't do that, then you're kind of perpetually condemned to cycling through this experience of being like smashed by the ocean, and then kind of coming back to shore, and you get exhausted really quickly.
That's an excellent analogy. I really like that. When you made a post on Instagram a while back that I really appreciated. You were talking about the difference between being a casual learner and a more dedicated learner. People often talk about the value of regular exposure to an activity in order to build the neurological connections that help us perform them better. In jiu-jitsu, obviously that means, showing up regularly, rolling often, drilling often. In your opinion, how crucial to the process of learning to survive on the mats is consistent attendance?
I think it's essential. One of the things over the years, anytime you are involved in an activity long term, you're going to have a wider variety of experiences than if you have a shorter time in that activity. So in jiu-jitsu, if your entire jiu-jitsu career, like if you look at it, if we were talking kind of just in extremes and, to exaggerate, if your whole jiu-jitsu career was 1 week long, every day you go might be amazing. And, you're going to have 100% of your time, or like 90% of your time, you're going to love it. If your jiu-jitsu career is 20 years long, you may have significant periods of time, weeks or months, and for some people like years, where you're not at a peak, but you're in a valley. You're like way down here, or you're at a plateau, which can be equally frustrating or sometimes more frustrating than feeling like you're down in a valley where things are, you're suffering. The flat line sometimes for people is like, I'm not making progress. I'm not getting any worse, but I'm not getting any better. And they kind of lose their will to train. So anytime you're experiencing these ups and downs, you can, if you haven't committed to the training, In other words, if it's not something that like somewhere in your head, you've said to yourself, okay, this is something that I'm doing, and it's not a decision that I'm making day to day, but rather it's a decision that I already made in the past, and I'm just kind of following through with what I'm doing. Then it's like the daily variations are just that. They're just variations in a much larger arc. The arc overall is trending up. You know, it's like what they say about the stock market. You know, they say like if you invest in the stock market, eventually it's going to grow. But it's not like day trading. You know, day trading, you know, sometimes you can make $10,000 and then you can lose $20,000. It has these like very big arcs, you know, these kind of extreme amplitude. Overall, if you're showing up and you're showing up in a place where you're probably not going to get like catastrophically injured because there are no safety protocols, or you're showing up and you're getting good counsel and good instruction and like all these other things that we talked about, you know, like you have a pretty good place, then generally speaking, the more you're training, the more experience you have, the more often you're on the mat, the greater your understanding of how all the pieces fit together will be. And so in a way, you can't help but get better by being on the mat, even in, and I know some people may disagree with this, but like even in a mediocre environment, you know, even in a place where it's like, maybe you feel like, you know, it's not like, to you, it's mediocre. You know, it's like not exactly, I don't know, it's not like a name school or like a name coach or whatever it is. Like, even if it's kind of in the, like, you're still getting better by virtue of coming in and training and practicing and learning and being a student. And I think one thing that people who are learning jiu-jitsu, I think could do as a favor to themselves is to think more long-term like this. That if your investment is in the practice, you're not going like it has to be fun every day, because it's not going to be fun every day. It doesn't have to work out in your favor every day. You're not going to like win every day or come out on top every day. You're going to have long periods of time. Like the longer you train, the more days you're going to have that will suck. And that's just like math. You know, that's just like mathematical distribution. You're going to have, if you only train one day and that's your whole career, you're going to be like, you're one for one. But like when that denominator changes, you're going to feel like, it's going to be a big difference. So kind of to get back to your question, yeah, like showing up to train, being consistent, training regularly, not deciding that morning if you're going to training. And that was, again, this is all like, this is from, all of these senior students that I was telling you about. Like, this is from Mr. Danaher. It's like, you show up, rain or shine, you show up, holiday or not, you show up, sick or well, you show up, and you show up to train. Now, your capacity on each of those days is different, because if you're showing up to train after having broken your arm and you're in a cast, your training is not getting out there and moving around. It's doing what you can do. Maybe it means you're sitting on the sidelines watching. And I remember, like, I'll tell you a quick story, but pretty early on, I was working a job that had me, like, I was doing some moving things. It was like, I wasn't exactly a mover, but I was like moving some things. And this was like maybe 2 months or 3 months into starting jiu-jitsu. And I remember that I was moving like a mattress through a doorway, and there was a part of the doorway that was sharp, and my hand got caught in there and it just sliced my hand open. So my hand was cut. I had to have stitches. And again, it was early on in the training, and I was like, I didn't want to miss the class, but I knew I couldn't participate. So I didn't really know what I was supposed to do, but I showed up. Like that was, I had a schedule, and it was like whatever it was, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And it was like, I got my hand got cut on Wednesday morning. And I was like, Wednesday night is the night I go to jiu-jitsu. So I went, and, I had my hand all wrapped up. And I remember I went and I was sitting on the bench, and Renzo was teaching the class at night. And I didn't usually go at night. I was there usually I was there during the day. That was the time that I usually was there. But, and Miss Danaher was teaching those classes, but, maybe I was getting stitch up or whatever it was. And so I knew like Wednesday was my jiu-jitsu day, and I went at night. So I was sitting on the bench, and I remember Renzo came over, and he was, he said, like, what are you, why aren't you on the mat? And I said, oh, I can't train because I was working and I had this cut, but I did want to come and watch. And I just remember he kind of looked at me, and he was like, And it was like an instant. And I guarantee, like, if you ask him about it, I'm sure like he would have zero recollection of it. It was like 20 years ago, and it was just like a moment in time. But I just remember there was a feeling of like, respect is too high, like too strong a word, but it was like, there was a sense of like his approval that I had done. Like I was kind of doing the right thing. And I remember at that moment, I was like, it was a really meaningful thing, because it wasn't, I don't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't like, like get your ass in a gi and get out there. Like, I don't know, like, you're weak, or like, well, who cares about your injury, or like anything like that. It was like an acknowledgement in that moment that even though I wasn't able to participate in the way that I would normally have wanted to, or maybe that he would have wanted me to, I was there, and I was training in a way, like as close as I could be. And I think that for a lot of people, they look at setbacks, problems, and, injuries on the mat, or like life issues, changes in schedule. Someone gets married, someone gets divorced, someone dies, you lose your job, like everything goes upside down. And it's like, oh, like I got to get everything together before I go back to training. And I remember like that day, the lesson for me was, that's actually not how it works. That actually it's not like get everything together and come back when you're okay, and then I'll teach you jiu-jitsu. The lesson for me that day was, if you come, like if you're able to come in, like that's the training. And a friend of mine used to say this too. Like he used to say, even if you show up, and I thought this was a really beautiful point. He said, like, even if you show up and the door is locked, because there actually were days, like way back when, even before the Blue Basement, when we were in the methadone clinic, there were days when we would show up and the instructor was late, or someone couldn't make it, or we didn't know. And there was a group of people outside and the door was locked. And I remember he said, like, this is the training. And it's not like a metaphysical thing. It's like you did your part. You showed up, and that's like the commitment. And even though the door was locked, like it's not ideal outcome, but it doesn't have to do with you. You did your thing. Like you did what you could do. And so I think that people showing up on the mat, like getting on the mat every day, regardless of what's going on, that is true for Gordon Ryan and Gary Tonin. That's true for Marigali. That's true for, like, name anybody who has not just like achieved really like high levels, but it's just a really great practitioner. And like all of those guys before, and when I look at them and like before they're champions, they're great jiu-jitsu people. Like they're just, if they never won a medal or never won a tournament, like if you saw them training and you were training with them, you'd be like, this guy is just unbelievable. Like next level. It's an inspiration. It's a reason to do jiu-jitsu. And like, when you see those guys, like that's a common thread. And I think that that's not something that you need to be a black belt world champion to implement. I think you can implement that as a blue belt, like, you know, you can be like a ex-hippie loser white belt like yours truly. And you can be so clumsy at your job that you cut your hand and can't do jiu-jitsu, but you can still show up. And I think that, you know, there's a difference between it being like an optimal outcome and like an ideal outcome. And, you know, you can't always get your ideal, but you can make your situation as optimal as you can. You show up when you can, do what you can, and then make sure that you're consistent and you're committed.
You said earlier in your introduction that you didn't have any athletic background. You even said that you often felt you perceived yourself as one of the weaker guys in the room, is what you said earlier. With that in mind, what positions and techniques in particular do you think you found yourself relying on most, and how did that change over time as you got better?
Yeah, I think that's a good question to ask. I mean, I found myself, you know, I was a smaller person. I was always playing bottom. You know, I was always playing guard. And I feel like, honestly, I didn't really, not that I wasn't taught this, because I think I was taught the right way. I think I couldn't learn how to like really pass the guard. I still feel like I'm learning how to pass the guard, but I feel like I couldn't, I didn't really learn how to pass the guard until I think like well into purple belt. Like, I think I was like well into purple belt before I was like, oh, this is kind of, I'm getting the hang of this a little bit, you know? And so a lot of time was spent on the bottom just because even if I made it to a top position, I was reversed like right away. You know, I was put, you know, if I got to the mount, someone bumped me off. Even if I got to the top of cross side, I was like bench pressed off, or someone, you know, just double legged me out of the bottom, you know, came up out of the bottom and double legged me. So the guard was really, really important. And the good news was that in the kind of the culture of Renzo's at the time, he was a top player, but he was a guard player too. And the guard was really considered the thing of jiu-jitsu. Like, that was the thing. And Renzo had a super strong top game. His no-gi top game was really, you know, kind of revolutionary for the time. But I was playing a lot of guard. And so close guard was not always the easiest for me to play. I mean, I could get there, but anytime you're in the close guard, you kind of have to unlock it if you want to attack. And I felt like I could get there as a safe position, but then to actually be able to attack from there was not the easiest. So one of the first things that I learned from Mr. Danaher was the clamp guard. And that was, you know, the part of the reason why I wanted to share that with everybody was that it became a tool for me early on that was like, it was open guard play, but it was a combination of like retention skills. So I found that I wasn't getting my guard passed quite as quickly. And then I was actually able to start to submit people from the bottom. And when I learned that, I was like, oh, you know what? Like, you can have someone who's bigger and stronger who's really driving down on you. And, you know, at the time, we didn't have, like, earlier on, it's funny, it's like things do work in cycles in jiu-jitsu, but, you know, at the time, it wasn't like, there wasn't a lot of like loose passing. There was Toriando passing and stuff like that, but it hadn't evolved to the place that it's in right now with like high levels of like, you know, leg drags, loose passing and camping passing and all that stuff that wasn't really around. There was much more like pressure passing, where it was in the same way that kind of the body lock has become a go-to technique for people, especially no-gi. At the time, it was just like heavy, hard passing where people were taking, you know, strong underhooks. They were knee cutting, and there was like a lot of like chest to chest pressure, half guard. And I just remember being on the bottom and feeling like, if I can get to this like the clamp guard, or if I can get to like a knee shield position, or if I can get a foot inside for like half butterfly, those sorts of things let me survive first. They were retention tools. I could manage the distance. And then from there, maybe I would last, like at the beginning, maybe I would last the round. Whereas before I was just like getting totally demolished. And then over time, I was like, oh, wait, I'm not only lasting the round, like surviving, but actually I'm able to enter into submissions. I can become a credible threat from the bottom. So both the clamp guard and half butterfly were really huge. Half butterfly, like a little bit later when we started doing more leg work, you know, when Danaher's leg lock system, you know, like the leg lock system, I think that people feel like it kind of started in like 2017 or whenever, you know, started in like 2016. And then he kind of solidified it on the, you know, the Fanatics video, his first leg lock video. That thing had been around since since the year 2000, you know, we had been, you know, it was been like in R&D, you know, research and development that whole time. So, you know, earlier on in the iterations of that stuff, when I was learning half butterfly guard, that was when, then it was like leg locks became very important. Ashigarami became very important. Again, another kind of guard that you can use to regulate distance and at the same time be offensive. So you're not caught in like this defensive cycle where people are just kind of, oh, like, you know, they kind of smash you, you push them back, they smash you again, and it becomes this exhausting thing. So as a result of that, when you play a lot of clamp guard, you play a lot of, you find triangles a lot, you find kimuras a lot, you find omoplatas a lot. When you play half butterfly guard, you're finding sumigeshi a lot, you know, the butterfly sweep or the hook sweep, people call it. You find entry into ashigarami or leg attacks a lot. So as a result, those things became like the staples of my practice. It was triangles, kimuras, omoplata. It was ashigarami leg locks, gi and no gi, and it was sumigeshi. And, you know, again, all of that stuff filtered down into me from my peers, but most importantly, you know, Mr. Danaher. It was like the things that would eventually become the foundation. It was the things that would eventually become the foundation for, you know, all of his innovations that people now know about because of BJJ Fanatics and the work that he's done there.
That's really incredible, man. You know, Brian, I think when a lot of times when people think of survival in jiu-jitsu, I think the first mental picture that might come to mind is escaping a bad position or preventing a submission attempt. And you know, obviously the ability to escape bad spots and, you know, without the ability to escape bad spots, rather, it'd be hard to survive for very long. What do you feel are some of the technical pillars of escaping bad positions that everyone at all levels should focus on?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that the two things that are most important for overall survival are guard retention and like managing distance. And then you have to be able to escape. You have to be able to escape pins and bad positions. The two positions that I think I found myself in most often, especially earlier on, was cross-side variations, and the mounted position. So one of the ways that, you know, one of our approaches is to usually like kind of start from a bad position. And a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times, both when I teach and then especially recently when I've been with Professor Danaher and he's been teaching, a lot of times it's about starting in a negative escaping first, and then going into your attack. So the things that made the biggest difference from the cross-side position were learning how to get to the half guard. So essentially understanding what all the standard elements of, the knee elbow escape, bridging, the idea of creating, of off balancing your partner. Everybody likes to talk about, use this word kazushi, the idea of off balancing somebody or creating an imbalance in their positioning so that you can then go ahead and either insert a frame or a post and maintain distance, make some distance, those sorts of things. So the idea from cross-side of learning how to knee elbow escape, learning how to use a bridge properly. And I'll say, again, I was not the strongest person. Bridging is not my strong suit, but I feel like I was able to learn how to bridge to be able to make space, even if I couldn't bridge to execute a full escape. So, that's an example. And then once you're in the half guard, understanding what like the basics of half guard look like, I think that's a very important thing. It doesn't have directly to do with escaping, but it's critical. From the mounted position, obviously the king of all escapes is the knee elbow escape. You have to be able to master that. And then all the variations of the knee elbow escape and how to join it to other techniques like the bump and roll, because you're going to have bigger people, stronger people who are holding you down, and performing a direct escape, kind of like a 1-to-1. He mounts and I do the knee elbow escape. At a high level, that doesn't work. So again, understanding how it fits into the context of a broader escape plan. Kipping, learning how to kip was a huge innovation for us. A lot of the DDS guys became well known for their ability to kip. Gordon, of course, is the best, example of that. Like his ability to get out from the bottom of the mount is insane. Gary, all of these guys who can just like, it's just impossible to hold them down. Kipping was a huge thing for us. I think that in terms of technique, and then like the overarching concept, Ryan, that I think the clamp and half butterfly, and then all these escapes that we're talking about have in common is this notion of inside position. And I think that when you really can understand, and this was something that was instilled in me pretty early on in the training, like technically, if you can gain and establish an inside position on your partner, then a lot of your defense becomes much easier. You become harder to attack. Now, I know that there are like kind of differing schools of thought. Some people favor outside position. People like to play, and with great success, De La Hiva guard and Berimbolos and attacks on the outside. For us, it's always been about inside position. It's been about inside bicep position when we're standing. It's been about inside hip position when we're framing. It's been about inside leg position when we're doing ashigarami. So that was like a really unifying defensive concept. And then all the manifestations of that, the ones that I just named, I think like you can't really survive in jiu-jitsu without understanding those.
Yeah, that's a very, very great point. All very, very great pieces of advice you're giving here. I really appreciate that fighting for the inside position concept you talked about, because that's something that Paul Creighton really drilled into me over the years, was understanding that before anything else, the whole battle that exists before anything really goes is winning that inside position, from no matter where you're at, like you mentioned, from standing, from the ground. So you have really tremendous advice. There's something you said earlier, Brian, that I wanted to make sure we circle back to before I forget, because I think it's really important to zoom in on. You mentioned that the part of in your journey in jiu-jitsu, it's not just that you want to only learn to survive, you also want to learn to thrive eventually. At what point in your journey do you feel like you really started thriving? Do you remember when you felt like you were not just getting by, but also able to put it on other people too?
I mean, I think that was, I think that there were, you get glimpses of that, I think, all like throughout your training, and like you get kind of rays of light through the clouds, because there is at the beginning not that much works. And so you get these like flashes of success, or things going your way. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're like submitting somebody or throwing somebody. It's just like I remember, like I remember there was a really tough guy who was a purple belt at the, when we were at Henzo's in the methadone clinic. This guy was like a hardcore competitor at a time where, you got to remember in 2000, by the way, just for people who are watching, in 2000, it was like, now if you want to do a jiu-jitsu tournament, there's like a tournament every weekend. Back then it was like once every, like maybe quarterly. Yeah. There was like a tournament maybe. So like, there was like, it wasn't as much of a thing, it was like, people were not trying to do it that much. It wasn't like how, in Brazil, you would hear these, you'd hear these rumors, like in Brazil, it's like, oh, there are tournaments every weekend. People are competing every weekend. For us, it was like every 4 months, every 3 or 4 months. But this guy was like legendary purple belt. And I remember he mounted, like we had a training session. He passed my guard. He mounted me, and he wanted to key lock me, like he wanted to do the Americana. And I had just learned the defense to the key lock. And I remember I don't know how long the round was, but like if it was like a 6-minute round, like he mounted me in minute 2. And then for the next 4 minutes was like just trying to key lock me. It was like his mission in life. And I remember every time he did it, I would bridge and slip my elbow. And he was like a dog with a bone. Like he wouldn't let it go. There was like something in his head where he was like, I'm going to submit this guy with a key lock. Like, I'm just going to do it. Like he wouldn't, if he had transitioned to something else, like he probably would have like taken my back and finished me in like a minute, but he didn't. He was just there, like like going. And I was just right there with him. Now I wasn't getting out of the mount, but there was like this victory in this. I was like, you know what? Like, I might not be good, but I don't suck. And so you get these little glimpses. And I think it's kind of like there's like this potential to like go beyond just surviving. It's like a seed that you get. And I think that like probably for me, like around purple belt, I started to feel like I had enough things. I certainly, like, even now, you know, there's much more that I don't know than that I actually like do know. And then like even the things that I do know, I can't do them all, you know, like under pressure. Yeah, sure. But I think that's like I think it's a universal thing, you know. I think it's like, but I think like around purple belt, I was like, the stuff that I know like pretty well enough so that if someone does come at me where, you know, and I mean, I'm sure there were times over the years where people were like actually trying to hurt me, but you know, like even if someone just comes at you kind of hard, you know, they want to, you know, not bad intentions, but they will really want to submit you. They really, you know, it's like they really want to get it. There was a period of time, like when I was a purple belt, where I was like, I know what I know well enough so that if that happens, I kind of like my chances, you know? And there were also some things that I was doing at the time that, you know, because of Mr. Danaher, where I was like, this stuff is really like from another planet. You know, people were like, I mean, just leg locks, you know, like back in the day, it's like, people were like, nobody knew what to do with them at all. Yeah. So there were a few things like that where I was like, I'm not just like, this is not survival anymore. Like, this is like, you know, I can do a few things. Now, you know, there were certainly a lot of people who I was just surviving with, you know, but overall, in terms of like how I thought about the training, how I thought about my progress, I was like, yeah, you know, like things are happening enough so that I'm past that threshold. I was like out past the break, you know, still getting smashed by the big waves, but I was out past the break and I was like, I'm pretty good here, you know?
That's awesome. That's got to be a great feeling though, coming from, you know, being in that place, starting where you were, and then arriving in that place where you feel like you're past the breaker. That must have been a pretty incredible feeling though, deep down. What words of encouragement would you offer a struggling beginner who's listening right now, who may be on the fence about whether or not they're ever going to make it in jiu-jitsu or whether or not it's even for them?
I think that that's a good question. Framing your practice in the right way makes a big difference. And it's really easy. It's easier even now than it used to be. I think like when I was a white belt or a blue belt, it's easier to compare yourself to how other people are doing. And that is not usually a recipe for success. It's like there is a kind of inspiration that you can get, like you can feel like dissatisfied with your own performance or how you're doing. And you can look around, you can be like, oh, you know, that person's doing really well. Maybe I'm underperforming relative to my potential and capacity, and I can do a little bit more than I'm doing. But like comparisons don't usually yield the best results for you as a practitioner. Because there are a million reasons why. And and I'm talking now to people who are early on, we're talking like white belts or blue belts. And, when you start dealing with people who are in the upper echelons of, of anything, but like, you're talking about like the top 10% of blue belts in the world or top 5% or, that's like a different story. And the things that motivate that sort of person or the kind of their goals are very different than the goals that motivate not just like a practitioner. And by the way, like, I know people use the word hobbyist now. It's not, I don't really like that as a word because I think it's, I think it kind of diminishes like the effort of someone who is like training, but not a professional, which is like, I don't know, like 80% of people who do jiu-jitsu. It's like, yeah, like there certainly are people who are hobbyists where it's like, but like, I know plenty of people who are not competitor, like hardcore competitors. Maybe they compete every once in a while. They're not building like a ship in a bottle at home. Like that's a hobby. They're not like playing checkers on the weekends. They're going to jiu-jitsu 3 times a week. They're learning how to do, cross ashigarami. Like, I don't know, like maybe you're a hobbyist, but so anyways, I kind of tend to say like practitioners, but I think that, people who are, I think that if you're kind of a practitioner, you need to understand like what's the goal? Like, what are you actually doing without necessarily comparing yourself to someone else, unless it's helpful for you. How are you, are you, this is another place that your instructor can be very useful because it's like, hey, if Ryan, if you're my instructor, I'll come to you and I'm going to say like, what do I need to work on? Or like, what's, if I bring a specific question to you or a specific question about my progress and I get an answer, then I have a direction to go in. And as long as you're like a trusted, reliable source for me, then that's going to be helpful. And it's going to move me in the direction. It doesn't matter if someone else's focus is leg locks, and I'll give you to give you an example. When we in the early days, and then even like not so early days, no gi until like relatively recently was like this kind of weird thing that got like, it was like, was it jiu-jitsu? Like it was like, it was kind of like submission grappling was this weird thing. It was mostly related to MMA. It didn't really have an identity of its own. And then, even though ADCC was going on, if you go back and you look at old ADCCs, it wasn't like the level of practitioner and kind of what they were doing was much different than, of course, how it is now. Yeah. But, like if you were doing no gi in, 15 years ago, there were a lot of people who were like, why are you doing that? Like, look at so-and-so, that person's a world champion. Like that's what they're doing. That's real jiu-jitsu. That's what it's supposed to look like. And so if you end up comparing yourself, you take a no-gi practitioner at the time, and that person's always comparing themselves to how a gi practitioner is doing, they're going to feel like, oh, well, I shouldn't be doing no gi. I should be doing gi. I'm wasting my time. But we know now, looking back, that was not really, that wouldn't be accurate. It would be like, okay, there's a validity to both, but it's hard to have that perspective. So like the main piece of advice I would give to people is try to avoid, whenever possible, like falling into the trap of comparing yourself to someone else's progress. If you can stay attuned to best practices in jiu-jitsu overall, if you have a good relationship with your instructor and you can kind of hear what they're saying to you, and it's not always what you want to hear, it's often what you need to hear in order to get better. If you can listen to that and you can have that as kind of the engine of your work, you'll be able to move through some of these valleys or some of these plateaus. You also need to be very patient, and I think jiu-jitsu is not a great place for impatient people. The good news is that it also teaches, kind of in the practice of it, it teaches patience because you have no choice except to, you have to you have to spend time on the mat. You know, you have to be in the bottom of the mount if you want to be comfortable escaping the mount. You have to be in the heel hook in order to be comfortable escaping the heel hook. So it rewards patience as well. Yeah. So I think in terms of mindset, I think those things are the most useful, and just getting on the mat, you know, every day, regardless of how you feel. Not every day has to be, you know, Mr. Danaher has always said this, you know, you don't have to train hard every day, but you do need to train every day. And it may look different from day to day, but you have to be doing something if you want to really see long-term progress.
That is excellent. I really appreciate all that insight. That's really, really good advice you gave. I appreciate that. Brian, I'll tell you what, man, we've reached a point of the show. This is where I always play a game with my guests. This is a game called The Pummel. The Pummel is a series of random questions. Some of these have to do with jiu-jitsu. Some of them have nothing to do with jiu-jitsu. But it's basically like a lightning round. But if you're down to play The Pummel, I'd love to play this game with you.
Sure, let's do it.
All right, man. Question 1. What's the worst job you ever had?
Okay. The worst job I ever had was I worked at a grocery store stocking the salad bar, and it was freezing cold, and I had no idea what I was doing. Everybody who was there seemed to have been there much longer than me. I was the low man on the totem pole, and it was just for whatever reason, it was just awful. And so that job lasted 2 days. And then I vowed that I would eat salad, but I would never work at a salad bar.
That's definitely relatable. I've had plenty of stuff just like that. Yeah. What do you think is a secret talent that you have that people might not be aware of?
A secret talent?
Play any instruments? Can you dance? Can you cook?
No, I can't do any of that stuff. My secret, I don't know, Ryan. I'm sorry. I feel like I was doing such a good job.
You're
doing such a good job of talking.
You're doing great. You're killing it. You're doing awesome. There's one here. I'll skip you to the next one. How about this? What's something you wish you were better at?
I wish I was better at.
You got to say.
I wish I was better at the lightning round. I wish I was better at thinking. I wish I was better at thinking faster, thinking on my feet.
Good answer. I like it. What do you think is the worst injury that you've had in jiu-jitsu?
Thankfully, I think the worst injury is I tore my meniscus when I was the day I got my purple belt. I think I tore my meniscus. Oh, wow. And then I couldn't train for a couple months, or it actually wasn't even that long. It was maybe 6 weeks. And it's still, once you get an injury like that, there's always the body remembers that sort of thing. So I'm healed up completely. I mean, this is probably 15 years ago, but it was no fun. My whole knee, my knee locked out. I lived in a 4th floor walk up, so I couldn't walk up the stairs. Oh. And in terms of quality of life, it was a pretty big bummer.
Yeah, that's a terrible way to arrive to purple belt, man. I'm glad you got through it though. But that's horrible.
Yeah. And then you have to come back from it because it's then you've been out for 6 weeks and you're a newly minted purple belt and everybody wants to kill you. So that was no fun either.
Oh man. And what do you think is your most hated position in jiu-jitsu to get stuck in?
50-50, man. And I'll tell you, I'm avidly working my way through it right now. Just in the last, every once in a while I come back to it. But the last 3 or 4 weeks, I was maybe a month ago, maybe not quite a month ago. I was saying to the guys I train with, I was I hate this position. We're just going to start here for we're going to start here for the next couple weeks. And maybe I'll learn to love it or at least hate it less, but it's a drag.
That's my hated position too. And it's funny that you say that because I'm trying to work my way through options because I end up there just through entanglements and things. I end up there sometimes. And once I'm there, it's all right, well, here I am and I don't know where the hell to go. I don't know what I like to do here. So I'm trying to focus on things I like. So I'll pick your brain if you don't mind. I'll pick your brain off air at some point and figure out what some good options are. Cause I'm kind of, that's where I get stuck to, I think. What do you think is your favorite bad food to eat?
My diet is pretty good. I don't really eat bad food too much, but I like a good chocolate chip cookie. If that's on the menu, then you sign me up for that. I'll be pretty happy.
That's awesome. Good one. What's your most hated food? What's something you cannot eat no matter what?
I'm a pretty adventurous eater. So food wise, I'm willing to kind of try just about anything. I don't really like, what don't I like? I don't like spinach. I'm not a spinach guy. That's a tough one because it's such a, it's like a superfood, nutritionally dense, but no spinach.
I hear you.
Keep that off the menu.
What do you think was the scariest moment of your life?
I ride a bike. I've been knocked off the bike a couple times. Oh, that's pretty scary.
Yeah.
Riding a bike in New York is kind of like, I've got a bunch of people who are like, they're about to start a support group, for me to like stop riding the bike. But good news is I don't ride it too much. Yeah, I don't ride it too much. Tend to be pretty safe, but I don't really like sports or like activities where like you're on something. You're like you're on a snowboard or you're on a surfboard or you're on a bike, but biking is kind of a necessary evil over here where we are. Because New York is so congested and traffic and parking and all that stuff. But that stuff that's pretty scary. And every once in a while, over here in New York, you occasionally you'll go by a like a street corner and they have like the memorial bike that's like it's like painted white, where like someone died. And I always think to myself, like, that person definitely woke up that morning and was like, hey, I'm just going to ride my bike to work or whatever. And then they got flattened by a truck. And so, yeah, if that happens, just, you can kind of keep this podcast as like an archive. And like, I kind of always knew it was coming, but yeah,
hopefully not. But yeah, I live in a pretty big congested city myself, and I see people occasionally flying by on a bike when I'm stuck in gridlock, and they'll fly by on a bike, and I'm like, half of me thinks like, God, that guy's brilliant. Like he's a genius for not being stuck where I am right now. Yeah. But at the same time, it's like, God, man, he just one mistake. So
man, you get people ride with no helmets and stuff like that. It's such like a low effort intervention, but people still don't do it. And it's like, if you've been like either clipped off your bike or you've like hit a patch of gravel and like you've fallen, this is no fun.
Brian, be safe out there, man. The jiu-jitsu world needs you, man. Stay safe.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah. I'm gonna get a motorcycle. That'll definitely up my chances of biting it on the road.
Oh man, who do you think's your favorite grappler of all time?
Oh man, I mean, there's just so many there. I think there are a lot of old school guys who people have forgotten about. Obviously, a lot of the guys who I've had the privilege of training with, I just love to watch them train. Gordon, obviously, Gary, more recently, Nicholas Marigali. And I was like, I was a big fan of Marigali even before he joined, New Wave and started training Mr. Danaher. But like, I think he's amazing. There were a couple of guys, like some of the old school gi guys. There was a guy who I remember just watching. It was just like, I was probably a blue belt or a purple belt. I was just like, wow. Fernando Margarita. I don't know if you remember him,
Margarita,
but like,
of course. Yeah.
Margarita was one of the first guys I watched. And I was just like, wow, this guy is amazing. Nino Schembri. Like early on, like I just like someone who was just so dynamic, such an exciting grappler to watch. Really like innovative and flexible and kind of weird, and that was I loved both those guys. There are people who I don't want to. At the risk of kind of being cliched, the greats are the greats though, like old Hickson, some of those old and it's interesting. Like, I think that a lot of times like newer generation people are like, like Hickson was never that good. Like that's the kind of thing, you hear people say that every once in a while. It's easy to say that now. If you have any memory of like, if you were around early on, like you really get an appreciation for how revolutionary what he was doing was, especially, you know, like all those old grappling tapes where he's like fighting all the wrestlers or he's doing challenge matches, that sort of stuff. If you understand it in its context, it's just, I still love it. Like I'll watch that stuff now and I'll be like, oh, it's so good. Yeah. You know, I always learn something new from watching Hodger's fights. You know, you can watch those over and over and over again and learn something every time you watch them. Fernando Terrere, you know, a lot of those, you know, a lot of those guys are just, their jiu-jitsu holds up over time if you go and watch it. You know, not everything holds up, but like some of that stuff was really revolutionary, and it was really, they knew what they were doing. They were real craftsmen, and changed how people trained and changed how people think. The Mendez brothers, you know, Rafa Mendez, Cobrinha, like, you know, those guys, sometimes, again, criticisms, people criticize, you know, like, oh, they did play 50-50 all the time. And it was just kind of this era of sweeping. But in terms of like technique, technical innovation, accomplishment, just like beautiful jiu-jitsu, I think that, you know, both of those guys are 100% on the list.
No, you named some of my absolute favorites, man. Obviously, in the modern era, all the new wave guys, obviously. But man, I love that you pointed out some guys like Nino Chambry, Margarita. I think my first jiu-jitsu video instructional I ever had, I think, was his.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
that's cool.
way back when. Yeah, and. I remember he had real broken English, but he was teaching pretty well regardless. And then Nino Chambry, like I remember Nino Chambry doing like rubber guardy type stuff way before even the Nogi, like the 10th Planet crew and stuff. So that was cool to see, because I'm flexible myself, so that really resonated with me. And then Terrere, you mentioned Terrere. I mean, man, if you want to watch just one of the most exciting athletes ever, Terrere.
Super athletic guy. And it's good to have, you need a mix of people who are like technical. Leo Vieira is another guy who I remember watching, and I was just like, this guy is like that. Like, if I could do, I remember thinking of watching Leo Vieira and like thinking, if I could do jiu-jitsu that like look like that even a little bit, I would feel like I would have accomplished, like way more than I expected, in jiu-jitsu. But you have these like smaller, lighter, very flexible guys. You have people who are very athletic, people who are bigger and just like pure technique, like no frills, a guy like Margarita. There's just, jiu-jitsu, part of the enjoyment of jiu-jitsu is practicing it, but there's also a sense in which, it's fun to watch someone do something that you do just at the highest level. And like, it's really, again, aesthetically, it's beautiful in a lot of cases. There is a sense of athleticism, but it's just, it can be really fun to watch. And I don't consider myself a fan, because I feel like that's like, you're kind of on the outside of it, but I definitely have, I am still kind of a fan of all those guys I mentioned. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great names. Yeah. Great choices, man. Those are great people you listed for sure. Let me ask you this. Who's your favorite superhero?
I've always liked the Green Lantern, but I'm not really a superhero guy. So, I think, my son is really into, Spider-Man, Miles Morales, but, he also likes Batman. So just kind of the pantheon, all those guys.
Good choices. If you could have a superpower, what would you choose?
Have my jiu-jitsu, a little better jiu-jitsu would be a good superpower for me to have, I think.
That's a good one. That's heightened abilities. I like it.
Yeah, heightened abilities. Yeah.
And final question for the Pummel Game, Brian. If a zombie apocalypse breaks out right now, what's the first thing you do?
You're going to find me in the corner of my room. I'll be curled up in a ball, crying and hoping that I can remember how to escape the mount,
That's excellent. And Brian, that was the final question of the Pummel Game. Congratulations. You win. You got your double underhooks.
Thanks. Great. Cool. Thank you. you.
You know, Brian, one of the most difficult phases I went through in my entire journey in jiu-jitsu was getting smashed from side control. And man, I'm not kidding when I said I must have spent about, 2 years maybe, where every single roll I was just utterly stuck inside and bottom side control. I eventually got better at escaping that position, and over the years I would still end up there a lot. But it wasn't until I was almost a purple belt that I started to realize that the real problem in my game was that I had really lousy guard retention. And you talked earlier about the importance of guard retention. So I wanted to ask you this, like in your opinion, in the hierarchy of important things to learn in order to survive longer on the mats, where does guard retention rank?
Right at the top. I mean, I think part of the thing about guard retention is that if you are not able to retain your guard, then a lot of the things that you're going to learn as a student in the classroom are not going to be relevant to you. So someone can teach you how to do the triangle. You can have great triangle mechanics. You can have great arm lock mechanics. You can have great guillotine mechanics. But if your guard is getting passed immediately, like right as soon as you slap hands with your partner, or as soon as you find yourself on your back, you have no sense of how to retain the guard, no ability to do it, then you may have that information, but it's going to be totally useless to you because you'll never be able to implement it. So at its heart, guard retention is distance management and your ability to understand where your partner is relative to you. That comes down to, I mean, that's really a big part of all of jiu-jitsu. You know, if you think about it, most jiu-jitsu is distance management. It's when you're in a negative position, it's about creating space. And when you're in a proactive or positive position, it's about you closing space, you know? So when we're defending, we tend to look to make space. When we're attacking, we tend to look to close space. And I think if you can understand how to do that from a guard retention perspective, you understand that that's the underlying idea, then a lot of the stuff that you're going to learn will make more sense. It's going to be in a context. So, you know, you can learn how to, do a high leg, pummel your legs, do a high leg. The action of that is important, but also kind of what you're trying to accomplish, like the end result is also what's important for you. So, I mean, guard retention is like one of those things. I think it's tough because it's like in jiu-jitsu, I think it's a soft skill. You know, we have hard skills that are more technical things, mechanics of how to do the arm lock or entries into the arm lock or entries into the, leg locks or passing the guard, those sorts of things. Guard retention it's like a collection of movements that happen in sequence, like in different sequences. And it's really context specific. So all of jiu-jitsu is built around your reactions, and your partner's reactions. So, as often, especially with more skilled people, but as often as possible, you want to be able to direct your partner to do what you want them to do, kind of funnel them into a particular scenario so that you can then do the things that you want to do. But guard retention is one of those things where you are so reactive, especially with high level people, that it can be difficult to have, it stops being an absolute and starts being like very relative. Like there are certain like absolute things in the triangle, like, you're always going to lock your legs a certain way in a, classic triangle. The mechanics are always going to basically be the same in like a, classic front triangle. But with guard retention, it's like what makes sense in the moment doesn't always what makes sense in one moment doesn't always make sense in the other moment. Sometimes it makes sense to hip out. Sometimes it makes sense to hip in. Sometimes it makes sense to pummel your leg. Sometimes it makes sense to bring the other leg inside. So I think it's one of those things that's much more difficult for people to learn in a traditional way where you go kind of step by step. It's much more context dependent. So developing good guard retention, I think, has a lot to do with two things. The first one is having a kind of training environment where you're not under so much pressure all the time that you can't actually slow things down and execute in the right way. There is a kind of like, I think there is a philosophy that people, subscribe to, where it's like, I'm just gonna like, your partner's gonna kind of throw everything they can at you, and then you'll learn how to, retain the guard, or you won't. But I think that leaves a lot to be desired, for most people. You're always going to get athletic, faster, younger people who can, who've learned how to do it, who can pummel their legs quicker, frame, post, and invert and all of that stuff. But when it comes to, guard retention, especially when someone is like, the harder part of guard retention a lot of times is someone standing and moving in front of you. If you're just kind of like, sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. And like, if you're more athletic, you'll be able to, that is not going to work for most people. So slowing things down enough so that you have a context where you can really understand how things are fitting together, you can respond to what your partner is doing, that sort of thing is going to help to maximize your ability to retain the guard. And then also understanding proper use of posting and frames and where you should put your hands and where you should put your feet and where you should put your knees, that sort of thing is going to be very, very useful, especially when someone is very close to you and in tight. But overall, I think, just to answer your original question, guard retention, essential. You have to be able to do it. And if you're under a lot of pressure and you're just getting smashed and you're getting your guard passed right away, it's going to be hard to get good at a lot of those other skills that you might be seeing, people do or having your instructor teach you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because when I was struggling with it before, one of the things I kept running into that I was mistakenly thinking was I was having trouble identifying what the actual problem was. Like I was thinking, okay, well, yeah, I'm not attacking well enough with my guillotine, and that's why they're able to pass, to pin my leg down and pass around. Or it was basically everything except the actual problem itself that I was trying to think of. Yeah. And that's something I appreciate now about the modern day in jiu-jitsu. There's a lot of these, like you said, these gray areas or these areas that are more softer skills that are getting a lot more focused now than I feel like when I was first coming up. When I was first coming up, I feel like the idea of doing guard retention drills was something that I didn't see that a lot. It was more, guard passing versus guard attacking drills and things like that. But it wasn't so much emphasis on the actual retaining of it,
Right. Yeah. And I think that's true. I think there are people who are, athleticism has always been a part of jiu-jitsu, but I think that there are more people now doing it. So you're seeing more people who are athletic. You're seeing more people who are younger who are doing it. Also, you're just seeing it more, like there's actually more opportunities to see what's going on. And so that kind of filters into the consciousness of people who are training, and it becomes a thing that's more important. But I will say that, when I was working with Mr. Danaher to do this ageless jiu-jitsu series for BJJ Fanatics, and first of all, I'll say I recommend that as a series just overall for people, especially for people who are older or less athletic, but even if you're not, there's just so much good information in there. But the idea of, being able to continue to retain your guard, even though you might not be as flexible or you might not be as naturally gifted or naturally talented or athletic or whatever, don't think that, I think the people who are listening to this shouldn't feel like just because you're not unusually flexible or fast, or, you look like Gordon or you move like the Rotolos, that you can't retain your guard. And I think that part of the reason why the video that I did, the reason that I focused on the clamp and we focused on half butterfly and leg stuff is because when you're able to understand how you can form a better connection to your partner, then a lot of the skills of retention become a lot easier. But like you were saying, sometimes you don't even know what you don't know. You're not even sure exactly what you're supposed to be working on. And one of the things that I think is important for people to understand is that you escaping kind of getting out of the position of having to retain your guard is one solution. So in other words, one solution to guard retention is don't play on your back, just be on top all the time. And like it is a solution, and I think it's a solution that some people do default to, where they're like, this whole thing about guard retention is a real pain in the neck and it's too much for me. So what I'm going to do is play top.
Right. Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that, but I think you don't want to dismiss one of the most important skills in jiu-jitsu, which is the ability to regulate and control distance from the bottom. And there are ways to do it. And one of the things, like I was telling you before, like one of the things that I learned to do really early on, had to learn to do, and then was taught how to do, was prevent a bigger, stronger person from just like smashing right through me. And that was retention. And some of it was about keeping them back, and some of it was about connecting to them so that they couldn't move away and create the sort of distance that they wanted to. And then using both of those skills, soft skills, to enter into attacks or sweeps or reversals of some sort. And I think that if you can have that as your mindset, where no, you can build a connection with somebody, you can make a connection that can be part of your retention, just as you can start to learn how to become a little bit looser, a little bit more, you can understand the context of what's going on and when to use what skills. If you combine all of that stuff together, then you're going to have a very robust formula for how to retain your guard and start to look to maintain and keep that distance. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, that kind of leads to something interesting that I really appreciate about retention, and that you kind of hinted at it earlier. It's something that Professor Danaher emphasizes a lot too, is the understanding of defensive and offensive cycles, and recognizing when it's time to be defending and when it's time to start attacking. Now, obviously, with survival, obviously that requires a very sturdy defensive game. But why is a good offense also really important to survival?
Well, I think that it's, again, it goes back to this question of surviving and thriving. Like, do you want to just survive? Because staying in a defensive cycle is just survival. You can, and sometimes, depending on the context, depending on you as a person or who you're partnered with or if you have physical limitations, sometimes the survival is the success of it all. If you are 3 weeks into jiu-jitsu and you're training with a black belt and you survive the round, which is to say you're not, you don't get submitted or you don't get your guard passed, well, that's a victory. We could consider that thriving. You're doing great. But if you're paired up with someone who is your ability, your size, your skill, your age, and that's all you're doing, it's kind of like another way I think of saying that is that you're kind of not working up to your potential, like your capacity. And the goal of jiu-jitsu, one of the major goals, but even from a self-defense context, one of the goals of jiu-jitsu is to end the fight, is to end the conflict, and it's to do it not by knocking somebody out or, smashing their head into the floor, but through, by subduing them through a submission, through a pin, into a submission, and really ultimately controlling somebody all the way through till the place where they can no longer fight. Right? That's kind of like how jiu-jitsu is framed in terms of self-defense. So if that's kind of the goal, then survival is only the first step of that. And so defense is a very critical part of it. But if you really want to finish, and we've always, one of the things that, Danner has always advocated has been this idea of finishing. You want to finish, you want to look for the submission. You may not always get it, but that is the submission is kind of the raison d'etre of jiu-jitsu. You want to get to the finishing position. And if you're only defending, then just kind of purely from the perspective of that goal, you're not really fulfilling the purpose of the training. That's number one. But then just more pragmatically, on a practical level, if all you're doing is defending, you're going to get tired. And like when you start getting tired, all of your resources are depleted. You're not able to retain as well. You're not able, if you do decide later on, to attack as well. Oftentimes you're not able to breathe as well because your diaphragm is getting compressed or the person sitting on top of you. So, ultimately, I think a purely defensive mindset runs out of gas before the finish line. And if you really want to fulfill the ultimate aim of jiu-jitsu, you want to be able to be getting to a better position. You want to be able to control your partner. And then you want to be able to end whatever is going on your terms and at your pace. So if you're always in a defensive cycle, it's like, it's kind of like being a boxer. If this was a different martial art, it's like if you were being a boxer, but you never throw a punch.
Right. Yeah.
Can you survive in the ring? It's like, yeah, I mean, I guess so. But anybody who was watching and probably anybody who is participating is like, that guy ain't doing so well.
Yeah, right.
Like he's not getting knocked out, but he's not knocking anybody out. He's not throwing any punches. So it's very much the same thing. And I think the idea of being in a defensive cycle in jiu-jitsu, it can be, it's a little, in boxing, it's really obvious. In jiu-jitsu, it's less obvious because you don't have this like kind of dramatic end to things. It's not like, the punch, the strike is very jarring for people, but it looks like you're doing something if all you're doing is retaining guard. But if you kind of take a step back, it's like, what really are you doing? Maybe not as much as you could be. So that's the mindset there. Yeah.
Great answer. Yeah. It's interesting how one of the things that I found myself struggling with when I was first, really focusing on my retention is I realized that, I am in completely defensive cycles. Like when I'm trying to prevent someone from passing me, I'm not causing any reason for them to step back for a second and say, okay, whoa, I can't just at will go in here and relentlessly attempt passing, because Ryan's going to try to throw something. He might try to throw an omoplata. If I do this way, he might try to get into a leg entry. So I like what you said there, because it really does emphasize the need to, yes, have good defense and yes, have good retention and manage that distance and everything, but also make the person think twice before just coming in, relentlessly on you. They have to feel some kind of threat. So very well said. Yeah. And speaking of positions and things you can rely on like that, you mentioned earlier the clamp position and how important that is for you. And in your instructional that you filmed with us, which I highly recommend everybody checking out, you dive in on the clamp a lot. For those not familiar with that position, what is the clamp exactly, and why is it such a valuable tool?
Yeah, so the clamp is a position so this is one of the very first things that Mr. Danaher taught me, and it was one of the things that really, when we talk about these kind of moments of feeling like you're thriving, even in the context where it's like things are not going that well. That was definitely one of those things, the kind of breakthrough moment. And it's something that I've used for a long time. He's taught it for a long time. And I think that he does continue to teach it, but I think it's not as, it doesn't feature as prominently as some of the other elements of his system, leg attacks, back attacks, that sort of stuff. But the clamp is such a useful tool. So the position itself, to describe it, it is in a situation like a closed guard. One of the problems with the closed guard is that to attack effectively, not with everything, but with a lot of attacks, you need to unlock your legs. Your legs are crossed. That's what provides you with the connection to your partner, control over their hips. But as soon as you want to start to attack, if you're going to do an arm lock, if you're going to do a triangle, your legs have to unlock. And it's often in that place where you don't have a connection and your partner starts to pressure forward. And then you start getting your partner steps over your legs and you're in the half guard. That's not really what you wanted. So the idea of the clamp is that if we can go just at kind of fundamental level, we can do it from a lot of positions, but even from the closed guard, once you unlock your guard, if you can transition from a closed guard position where you have good connection to an open guard position where you have good connection, you will have much better control over your partner and you'll be able to regulate the distance. So the clamp is a situation where we have one leg in front of our partner's shoulder as a wedge or a barrier, preventing them from driving forward. And then we have a second leg behind their back over their shoulder to prevent them from pulling back and away. So we're using our legs from a situation where our partner is close to us, to stop their forward movement and to stop their backward movement. And because our legs are not connected, we have a freedom of movement that allows us to start looking for submissions and getting out of just a defensive cycle. Out of that position, you're also able to control your partner's posture. And when you start controlling someone's posture from the guard, that's where a lot of major attacks start to come. You start to create not just a kind of Kazushi imbalance with your partner, but like an imbalance of attention also, where when your posture is broken, a lot of the passes that you want to perform are difficult. Standing up can be difficult. Having your hands free to work can be difficult. So the clamp is a way of using the strongest part of your body, which is your legs, against your partner's upper body. And when you can do that and you can start to control posture and you can start to regulate distance, then your arms can be used to control your partner's arms as well. So it's a situation where like you're able to bring to bear 4 of your limbs against your partner's upper body, the 2 limbs. And I say this in the video, but one of the things that I think is it's a kind of useful way of understanding what the clamp is to think about it as an upper body ashigarami. So like a leg entanglement, but instead of having your partner's leg trapped between your 2 legs, you have your partner's head and arm trapped between your 2 legs. And if you look at the ashigarami, you'll see that it is actually the same thing as the clamp. It's just the clamp for the lower body, so to speak. Yeah. So one of the reasons that there are a lot of reasons, but I think this is like the clamp is useful in and of itself, but then also it's super useful because it provides like a little bit of a conceptual bridge for people who want to understand more about control through ashigarami. Because if you understand the clamp very well, I think you can also understand, even just intuitively, but I mean, technically, you're going to understand how to use ashigarami better. And vice versa. If you already understand how to use ashigarami, especially Arimi ashigarami, then understanding how to use the clamp is not a big leap. Then it's like you have basically one solid skill that you can translate from like to 2 different areas. And I don't know, man, it's like, that's a pretty good thing because you don't have to have, it's kind of, when you start to see these things operating in similar ways, then your jiu-jitsu starts to become a little bit more cohesive. You don't need like one thing for the legs and one thing for the arms. I mean, you do, but like, if you can have something that works across these 2 territories, then it's a skill that you can, you know that it's going to be a robust skill because it's going to serve you in a bunch of different contexts. So that's a good introduction to the clamp. And then like you were saying, it gives you a chance to become offensive right away, to start attacking pretty quickly. And that's always a real strong tool, like a strong thing to have in your toolbox, where your partner, all of a sudden your partner, if they're passing tight, now maybe they're a little bit, more reticent about their passing, or they feel like they need to be a little bit more conservative. And in that space, you have a little more time and you can start to go to work. So that's why I chose that. I think I also feel very comfortable, teaching it because it's something that I've used over the years with a lot of like really talented people who I've been able to, have the privilege to train with. So.
That's outstanding. Well, I really appreciated how well you broke the position down, both here on the show and also in the instructional. I appreciate in the instructional how well you mapped out all the various directions you can go from there. It's a great transitionary position to go through to use as well. So there's all kinds of follow-ups and attacks and things like that. And you mapped it all out very well. And guys, if you're listening, I mean, this is an instructional. This is one of those instructionals where whether it's your first day in jiu-jitsu or whether you're a black belt, I think anyone can learn a lot from this instructional. So I really do recommend it. It's called Under Pressure, Retention, Recovery, and Attacking from Guard. And it's available right now at bjjfanatics.com. So make sure you guys go and pick it up. Brian, man, in closing, what are some of your major goals for this year? What are some things you hope to accomplish by the time 2023 is over?
Well, I think that always from year to year, my goals don't vary too much. I think that I'd like to continue. Obviously, I need to keep training and continuing to better understand jiu-jitsu and the practice. I want to continue to serve the students who I'm able to teach. I think that in terms of the training and the instructionals, we have the clamp. We have this another element of this Under Pressure series, which is going to be half butterfly guard. And depending on when people are listening to this, it may be out already. It's not. The first one that we're doing has to do with the clamp, because that's a situation where people are very much under like immediate pressure and there's close distance. Half butterfly is a little bit more of a mid-range approach to this same thing that we're talking about, like changing from defensive to offensive cycles, developing a sense of retention and understanding fundamentals of like a core position that allows you to start to attack right out of the guard. And then we're going to have a third one which is going to deal with a little bit longer range and the idea of entangling legs. And although we cover some leg entanglements in the half butterfly, this is going to focus a little bit more on using that longer range to form meaningful connections, so that, again, even if you're not a particularly athletic person, particularly strong person, particularly flexible person, you can get a meaningful connection on your partner that you can then convert into something that allows you to become a legitimate threat. So I'm looking forward to that. That's going to be a big part of this year, the remainder of this year. And just continuing to make sure that I stay in a student role. And, I've been fortunate enough to see Mr. Danaher a bunch of times this year already. So making sure that I stay in touch with him. I try to make it a practice because, again, we're not in the same state anymore, to be able to go back and train with my training partners down at New Wave, to be able to make sure I'm healthy and able to train. And, I think that's a big thing too, making sure that for people, anyone who has been doing anything for, 20 years, especially something that's as rigorous and involved as jiu-jitsu, you want to make sure that you're taking good care of yourself. So that's another priority. I think that we got to make sure that we're doing that as well. So, those are my major things for this year. And, I'm looking forward to it. First half of the year has been a good one. I'm looking forward to the second half being even better.
That sounds well, Brian, man. You are a wealth of knowledge, man. So I really appreciate your time here today. I'm very happy that you're making instructionals with us here at BJJ Fanatics, because the first one that I've seen so far has been outstanding. And man, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for the great interview.
Yes, my pleasure, and thanks so much. I'm grateful to be able to share a little bit of what I've learned over the years with people and BJJ Fanatics, Bernardo and Michael and you have really made it possible to do that. So I'm very grateful for that. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, folks, unfortunately, we're fresh out of time. Brian, this is one of my favorite conversations I've had on the show, man. I really appreciate you sitting down with us for a couple hours here and sharing your knowledge. Again, you're welcome back on the show anytime you'd like to come back. I appreciate your time.
Great. It's my pleasure. Anytime. Thanks so much.
So, absolutely. And for anyone out there that wants to keep up with Brian, it's real easy to do so. He's active on Facebook. You can find him there, but he's most active on Instagram. His Instagram is BZGlick. Make sure you guys are following him there. That's a great place to keep up with his instructionals and his daily content that he posts. He's also active on YouTube. If you guys type Brian Glick into YouTube, his channel should pop up. Make sure you guys subscribe and hit the little bell icon to get notified when new videos get added. And of course, guys, you can learn from Brian anywhere in the world here at BJJ Fanatics. He's got a great instructional out at the time of recording with another one that'll be out very soon. So by the time this episode posts, it might already be out there. The one we discussed in depth today is called Under Pressure, Retention, Recovery, and Attacking from Guard. And it's a tremendous instructional for all levels. So you guys get over there and check that out. And that's going to do it for this episode, everybody. I really appreciate you tuning in. Please stay tuned for the next episode of the BJJ Fanatics podcast.